What began as an ordinary flight from New York to Los Angeles soon spiraled into a dramatic confrontation that exposed deep-seated biases and racial prejudice. Jasmine Miller, a successful quality assurance manager, was just trying to get to an important business meeting in first class, when a tense encounter with a fellow passenger, Thomas White, quickly escalated into a public spectacle. His accusations against her were not only baseless but fueled by something far darker. What would unfold next would challenge everyone's assumptions and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about race, bias, and privilege. Have you ever witnessed a similar situation? Share where you're watching from, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and share for more thought-provoking content. On a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, a seemingly minor misunderstanding would quickly escalate into a public incident that would shine a harsh light on issues of racial prejudice. Jasmine Miller, a successful quality assurance manager, was aboard the plane, traveling in first class on her way to an important business meeting. She was a professional, accustomed to flying for work, and took comfort in the luxury and calm of first class. However, during this flight, Jasmine would find herself in the middle of an altercation that would disrupt her journey. Sitting next to her was Thomas White, a middle-aged man whose demeanor was tense, even from the start. It wasn't long before Thomas grew suspicious of Jasmine's presence. He began to glance at her repeatedly, his gaze lingering for longer than seemed natural. Jasmine, initially unaware of his growing unease, continued to read through her materials for work, but a sense of discomfort crept in as she felt his eyes on her. At first, Jasmine brushed it off, thinking that Thomas was simply lost in thought or distracted by something else. But when Thomas suddenly stood up and approached a flight attendant, his demeanor had shifted from casual to agitated. He pointed toward Jasmine, claiming that she was staring at him, and made accusations that Jasmine had taken something from his belongings. His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Jasmine, feeling both confused and violated, calmly denied the accusation. She explained that she hadn't even interacted with his bag and was simply minding her own business. Despite her calm response, the situation was escalating. Other passengers began whispering, glancing between the two of them. A few even shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What was initially an unfounded suspicion quickly turned into an intense confrontation, with Jasmine trying to assert her innocence while Thomas demanded that she be removed from the flight. This situation marked the beginning of a much larger issue. Jasmine was not just being accused of a minor misunderstanding but was now facing public scrutiny due to the racial dynamics at play. Her calm demeanor contrasted with Thomas's increasing agitation, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. The flight attendants, unsure of how to handle the situation, hesitated before taking any action, further exacerbating the growing atmosphere of discomfort. As the confrontation continued to unfold, the passengers began to take sides, with some showing support for Jasmine, while others sided with Thomas. The underlying issue of racial prejudice became clear. Jasmine, as a black woman, was being scrutinized unfairly, simply because of her presence and her race. The incident would go on to challenge not only the individuals involved but also the broader issue of how people of color were treated in situations like this. What began as a personal confrontation had now turned into a much larger conversation about race and bias. Jasmine Miller was a highly accomplished professional. As a quality assurance manager for a large tech firm, she was used to traveling frequently for work. The business trip she was on was no different, but today, there was something about this flight that felt off from the moment she boarded. The first-class cabin, usually a haven of quiet and relaxation, seemed filled with an undercurrent of tension. As Jasmine settled into her seat by the window, she tried to push away the feeling of discomfort that had settled in her chest. Her thoughts were on the meeting ahead, the contracts to review, and the negotiations that awaited her on the West Coast. However, she couldn't help but notice the man sitting across the aisle, Thomas White. He seemed to be eyeing her in a way that made her uneasy. She brushed it off at first, thinking perhaps he was just distracted or lost in his thoughts. However, as the flight went on, Jasmine began to feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just a fleeting glance, Thomas was watching her with an intensity that made her feel self-conscious. Jasmine had always been aware of how others perceived her, particularly when it came to traveling in first class. As a black woman, she had sometimes felt like an anomaly in spaces where she was often one of the few people of color. At first, Jasmine tried to dismiss it. It was common for people to be curious about the strangers seated near them, especially on long flights. But Thomas's attention began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. He would glance up every few moments, his eyes shifting back and forth between his seat and her face. The subtle unease grew into something more tangible, and Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that he was scrutinizing her for reasons she couldn't understand. After a while, Thomas stood up, seemingly to stretch his legs. He walked to the aisle, making a beeline for one of the flight attendants. Jasmine watched as the conversation began, his gestures growing more animated. She could hear snippets of his conversation. "She's been staring at me the entire flight," Thomas was saying. "I'm sure she took something from my bag." Jasmine's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She hadn't touched his bag at all, let alone gone through it. Her mind raced. Why was he accusing her of this? The flight attendant, a woman named Sarah, seemed taken aback. She glanced at Jasmine, then back at Thomas, unsure of how to proceed. Jasmine's voice was calm but firm as she interjected, trying to explain the situation. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her tone steady. "I've been sitting here, reading. I haven't touched anyone's belongings." Despite her attempt to de-escalate the situation, the tension was palpable. The cabin, once filled with the soft hum of the airplane's engines and quiet murmurs of other passengers, was now thick with discomfort. Some passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, trying to avoid eye contact, while others whispered among themselves. Jasmine, still composed but shaken, felt her pulse quicken. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, and for the first time, she realized that she was not just a woman accused of a simple misunderstanding. She was a black woman being unfairly targeted. The accusations only intensified as Thomas became more agitated. His voice grew louder, his claims more ridiculous, and Jasmine could feel the collective tension of the cabin shifting. The flight attendants, sensing the escalating conflict, seemed unsure of how to intervene, only adding to the growing sense of unease. Jasmine's calm was starting to crack. She had faced prejudice before, but this situation was different. The public nature of the incident, the audience of passengers, and the lack of any real action made it all the more humiliating. It was clear now that this wasn't just about a missing bag, it was about something deeper. It was about bias, assumptions, and the way certain passengers felt entitled to question and scrutinize others based on their race. Jasmine remained composed, refusing to let the situation spiral into something more than it already was, but in the back of her mind, she knew this was a much bigger issue. It wasn't just about her, it was about how systemic bias played out in everyday moments like these. As the confrontation between Jasmine and Thomas intensified, the atmosphere in the cabin grew more charged. The previously quiet hum of the aircraft now seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the escalating tension. Passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, while others visibly bristled at the growing noise. What had started as a petty accusation about a missing bag had turned into something much larger. It was no longer just an isolated incident between two passengers, it had become a spectacle, a flashpoint for deep-rooted prejudices to play out in a very public setting. Jasmine remained remarkably composed, her years of experience as a quality assurance manager giving her the tools to keep calm under pressure. She refused to let Thomas's loud accusations rattle her. But even as she firmly denied the claims, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. She was painfully aware that her calm response only seemed to escalate Thomas's agitation. His voice grew louder, more insistent, as he repeated the accusation that she had stolen something from him. "Everyone can see what's going on," Thomas shouted. "She's been watching me, and now my bag is gone." This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be intimidated by someone like her. His words dripped with contempt, and the room fell silent. Jasmine's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It wasn't just the absurdity of his claim, it was the racial undertones in his accusation. It was clear that Thomas's fear wasn't simply about a missing bag. His fear was of her. Fear of a black woman in a space he perhaps thought she didn't belong in. The flight attendants had no idea how to defuse the situation. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, approached cautiously but was at a loss for how to resolve the conflict. "Sir, we need to stay calm," Sarah said, trying to bring the temperature down. "We'll get someone to help. Please take a seat, and we'll sort this out." But Thomas was not hearing any of it. "I demand that she be removed from this plane," he insisted. "She's clearly a threat." His words were harsh, venomous even, and with each passing moment, it became clear that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Passengers in nearby seats were beginning to stir, some expressing frustration, others looking on in shock. Jasmine, who had been the calm center of the storm, could feel the tide turning against her. That was when Captain Michael Turner, the pilot, appeared at the front of the cabin. A veteran with years of experience handling difficult passengers, he immediately assessed the situation. He was well aware of the delicate balance required when dealing with conflicts like these. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but measured. His presence, calm and authoritative, temporarily quieted the tense atmosphere. Thomas immediately turned toward the captain, his face flushed with anger. "This woman is harassing me," he shouted. "She's been staring at me the entire flight, and now my bag is missing. I want her removed from this plane right now." Captain Turner took a deep breath. "Sir, we're not going to escalate this situation further. I'm asking you to sit down and let's talk this through." His voice was calm but authoritative, and he made eye contact with Thomas, letting him know that this wasn't going to be tolerated. Turning toward Jasmine, Captain Turner acknowledged her, his tone softening. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you're being put through this. We'll get this sorted out, but please bear with me. Let's keep this civil." He then motioned to the other flight attendants to begin de-escalating the situation, while he took control of the conversation. Jasmine, still maintaining her composure, nodded. "I understand. I just want to get to my destination without further issues." Her response was calm but firm, setting the tone for the resolution she hoped would come. As the captain moved to manage the situation, it became clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a reflection of deeper, systemic issues within society. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that this was part of a larger pattern of racial discrimination that she had experienced in various forms before. She could only hope that the situation would be resolved fairly, though she had little faith that this encounter would remain contained to the plane. It was clear that the ripples of this confrontation would reach far beyond the confines of the flight. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with discomfort as the situation reached a boiling point. Captain Michael Turner had stepped in, his authoritative presence causing the passengers to settle into an uneasy silence. He had managed to bring some order to the chaos, but the tension still hung heavily in the air. The accusatory words from Thomas White still echoed in Jasmine's ears, though she remained composed as best as she could. Thomas, still flushed with anger, sat down begrudgingly, his eyes shooting glares toward Jasmine as if daring her to look at him again. Jasmine could feel his gaze burning into her, but she refused to react. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her further. Her thoughts were already on the bigger picture, the way this incident wasn't just about her, but about the bias and prejudice embedded in everyday situations. Captain Turner took a moment to speak with the flight attendants, who were now gathered at the front, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension was palpable, and Jasmine knew that something had to be done to address the situation properly. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some sympathetic, others uncertain of what was going on. As the minutes ticked by, the cabin remained quiet, the tension simmering under the surface. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, David Cole, a businessman seated a few rows behind Jasmine, stood up. He made his way to the front of the cabin, his expression stern as he approached Captain Turner. "I'd like to apologize on behalf of my fellow passenger," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "What happened here was completely out of line, and as someone who has worked in customer service myself, I know that no one should have to deal with this kind of treatment." Jasmine glanced up in surprise. David's apology wasn't just a public acknowledgement of the incident, it was a moment of solidarity, a small act of decency in the face of what had been a deeply uncomfortable experience. The other passengers, who had been watching the situation unfold, began to nod in agreement, their earlier discomfort giving way to a sense of collective support for Jasmine. It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was a start. Thomas, on the other hand, looked even more furious. He had been caught in his own wrongdoing, and it seemed that his pride was taking a major hit. Still, he reluctantly muttered an apology, though his words were forced, barely audible. "I'm sorry," he grumbled, his voice edged with annoyance. Jasmine, feeling the eyes of everyone in the cabin on her, took a deep breath. She had been wronged, yes, but her composure had remained unshaken throughout the ordeal. The apology wasn't for her, it was for everyone who had witnessed the situation unfold. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. She turned to Captain Turner, who was still standing at the front of the cabin, overseeing the resolution. "Thank you for intervening," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your handling of this situation." Captain Turner nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry this happened," he said. "We will be sure to make a formal report to the airline. This shouldn't have gone on for as long as it did." The apology, while appreciated, didn't erase the damage. It didn't erase the sting of the accusations or the underlying issue of bias. Jasmine knew that this experience wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a broader problem that needed addressing. This was just one instance of many where people of color faced unjust treatment based on assumptions and stereotypes. As the plane continued its journey, Jasmine sat quietly, reflecting on the events that had just transpired. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was living through a turning point, not just for herself, but for the passengers and the airline. This incident had forced a conversation about race, bias, and the treatment of others, and it was a conversation that wasn't going to disappear anytime soon. The flight had eventually landed without further incident, but the aftermath of the confrontation lingered in the minds of everyone involved. As the passengers disembarked, many exchanged glances with Jasmine, offering quiet nods of support, but no one spoke openly about what had transpired. Jasmine could feel the weight of the entire experience settling on her shoulders, but she wasn't going to let it fade into the background. This was not just an isolated occurrence, it was part of a much larger issue that needed to be addressed, and she knew exactly what she had to do. After she returned home, Jasmine immediately began documenting the incident. She carefully wrote down the details of the confrontation, from the initial accusations to the forced apology. She didn't want to forget the emotions that had surged within her, the feeling of being unfairly targeted simply because of her race. But she also wanted to turn the experience into something constructive. She wasn't just going to let it slide. This wasn't just about one man's misunderstanding, it was about a systemic problem that needed to be confronted head-on. Jasmine submitted her report to the airline, detailing the events and highlighting the bias that had been evident throughout the ordeal. She also pointed out the lack of action from the flight attendants, who had been slow to intervene and had failed to de-escalate the situation properly. In her report, she framed the incident not as an isolated case of one individual's prejudice but as an example of a larger issue within the airline industry, the need for better conflict management, training on unconscious bias, and a commitment to fostering a more inclusive environment for all passengers. The airline, Apex Wings, initially responded with standard apologies and assurances that they would investigate the incident. However, the response didn't sit well with Jasmine. She knew that these kinds of statements were often made without any real intention of change. She didn't just want an apology, she wanted action. She wanted to see real changes in the way employees were trained to handle situations like hers. A week later, Jasmine received a call from the CEO of Apex Wings. The conversation was polite, but it quickly became clear that the company was grappling with the fallout from the incident. "Ms. Miller," the CEO said, "I want to assure you that we take this matter seriously. We're committed to addressing the issues you've raised, and we'll be reviewing our training programs immediately." Jasmine's skepticism was hard to hide. She had heard similar words from other organizations, only for them to fail to deliver meaningful change. "I appreciate your willingness to address this," she said, "but I want to see action. This isn't just about one employee, it's about a cultural shift that needs to happen within your company. This isn't just about me. It's about how your staff treats people of color, and I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." The CEO assured her that they were taking the matter seriously and promised that the airline would conduct a full review of their policies. They promised to incorporate diversity and inclusion training into their employee development programs and assured Jasmine that they would begin the process of revising their conflict resolution protocols. Despite the CEO's assurances, Jasmine remained cautiously optimistic. She knew that real change wasn't easy, but she also knew that her report had sparked a conversation. The incident had brought to light the glaring issues of bias that plagued the airline industry, and Jasmine wasn't going to let it fade away. She had already made plans to meet with diversity advocates and others who were passionate about pushing for systemic change within the airline sector. What happened next would not have been anticipated by anyone on that flight. In the days following the confrontation, snippets of the argument between Thomas and Jasmine began to surface online. Someone had secretly recorded parts of the exchange and uploaded them to social media. The footage quickly went viral. What had been a small altercation on a plane had now become a public spectacle, drawing national attention to the racial prejudice that still persisted in everyday life. The video showed Jasmine's calm demeanor as she denied the accusations, contrasted against Thomas's loud, aggressive behavior. It was clear to anyone watching that the situation was unjust. Jasmine had been unfairly targeted, and the flight crew's failure to act only compounded the issue. The video sparked a wave of outrage, with many viewers expressing disbelief that such behavior could still happen in today's society. The public reaction was swift and intense. Social media exploded with hashtags like #RespectOnThePlane and #NotYourScapegoat, as people voiced their support for Jasmine and condemned the actions of both Thomas and the airline staff. While some individuals took to the platform to defend Thomas, claiming that he was simply overreacting, the vast majority of commenters expressed their solidarity with Jasmine, condemning the racial profiling that had been so clearly displayed. Apex Wings, facing mounting pressure, issued a public statement in which they condemned the actions of Thomas and pledged to take immediate steps to address the issue. They confirmed that they were conducting a full investigation into the incident and would be reviewing their employee training policies, particularly in regards to handling situations involving racial bias. The airline also pledged to incorporate better conflict resolution training for their staff and promised to engage with external diversity experts to ensure their programs were comprehensive and effective. Despite the company's public response, Jasmine knew that this wasn't enough. She knew that the incident was just a symptom of a much larger problem that needed to be addressed at a systemic level. This wasn't about one rude passenger, it was about the culture that allowed his actions to go unchallenged for so long. It was about the deep-seated biases that existed within the airline industry and in society at large. Jasmine, now in the public eye, used the attention to push for lasting reforms. She began advocating for policies that would address racial bias head-on, calling for industries like aviation to implement stricter guidelines for diversity and inclusion. She pushed for transparency in how airlines handled customer complaints and how employees were trained to handle issues of race and prejudice. This was not the end of the conversation, it was just the beginning. Jasmine had taken a painful, public incident and turned it into a call for systemic change. Her advocacy and the support she garnered from the public created momentum for something much bigger than one unjust encounter. It sparked a nationwide conversation about race, bias, and accountability, one that would continue to reverberate throughout society for years to come. In the wake of the incident between Jasmine Miller and Thomas White, the media storm had not only caused a public relations crisis for Apex Wings, but it had also ignited an industry-wide conversation on racial bias and the treatment of passengers. The viral video showing the confrontation had captured the attention of millions, putting the airline in the hot seat for failing to address the issues of racial profiling and prejudice within its ranks. But Jasmine's calm and dignified response had positioned her as a symbol for what needed to change, and now, as the airline's management worked to manage the fallout, they had to figure out how to rebuild trust both within the company and with their passengers. The airline's leadership team, particularly its CEO, Robert Jackson, had been blindsided by the severity of the public response. What initially seemed like a small incident had turned into a national reckoning. The media coverage continued to grow, with commentators calling for corporate accountability and demanding that Apex Wings take swift action to address the cultural issues exposed by the incident. But the pressure wasn't just external, it was internal as well. Employees, many of whom had been working for the airline for years, were now questioning the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. They had witnessed firsthand how one passenger's bias had been allowed to disrupt a flight, and now they wanted to know what the company was doing to prevent such situations in the future. Jasmine's involvement with the situation was far from over. After submitting her detailed report to the airline and being contacted by the CEO, she now felt compelled to take a more active role in the company's transformation. She was determined to use her voice to push for change, not only for herself but for every passenger who had ever been unfairly treated in a similar way. This incident had given her a platform, and she knew it was her responsibility to use it for something bigger than just her personal grievance. In the days following the public apology issued by Apex Wings, Robert Jackson called for an emergency meeting with his leadership team. He made it clear that this was not just about repairing the airline's image, it was about systemic change. "We are not just going to issue another apology and hope this goes away," he said firmly. "We need to look inward and figure out how we can transform the culture of this company from the top down." Jasmine's report, which outlined the airline's failure to address racial bias and offered suggestions for employee training and policy changes, became the basis for their new internal reform plan. She was invited to join a newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, where she would work alongside external consultants and a few key senior executives to help reshape the airline's approach to customer service, conflict management, and diversity training. The first initiative was to completely overhaul the airline's employee training programs. The new courses would focus not only on customer service but on unconscious bias, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity. The airline would no longer ignore the subtle ways in which racial biases played out in everyday interactions between passengers and crew. Jasmine's experience, as well as the many similar experiences shared by people of color in the industry, was a stark reminder of how important it was for the airline to address these issues head-on. As part of the broader effort, Apex Wings also implemented a series of internal surveys to measure employee perceptions of diversity and inclusion. These surveys aimed to identify potential biases and provide leadership with a clearer picture of how employees viewed their company's culture. Jasmine, along with other members of the advisory board, pushed for transparency in these processes. She wanted to make sure that the airline wasn't simply going through the motions of diversity but was truly committed to creating an environment where all employees and passengers felt valued and respected. The road to rebuilding trust wasn't going to be easy. There were still employees who resisted the changes, some of whom felt uncomfortable with the idea of having their biases addressed. Others felt that the airline was overreacting to a single incident, dismissing the need for deeper change. But Jasmine remained resolute. She knew that this wasn't just about fixing a public relations issue, it was about changing the culture that had allowed the incident to happen in the first place. Her involvement in the company's reform efforts was not just a form of personal vindication, it was a chance to ensure that future passengers wouldn't have to go through the same thing. Apex Wings' public response to the viral video and the confrontation with Jasmine Miller had been swift, but the company knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to heal the wounds left by the incident. CEO Robert Jackson, alongside his leadership team, recognized that they had to not only address the immediate concerns but also take steps to rebuild the public's trust over the long term. While the first step was the apology, which many deemed insincere, it quickly became apparent that a more substantial and lasting response was required. The airline had to prove to both the public and its employees that it was committed to addressing racial prejudice and fostering inclusivity. Behind closed doors, Apex Wings was undergoing a fundamental reevaluation of its policies. The company enlisted external diversity consultants to audit its internal procedures and employee training programs. A critical part of this review was looking at how the airline handled customer complaints, especially those related to racial bias. A new set of protocols was put in place for how flight attendants and customer service representatives were trained to recognize and deal with racial profiling or discriminatory behavior, both from passengers and colleagues. These measures were aimed at ensuring that such an incident never happened again. Jasmine's report became the cornerstone of the company's new approach. She had carefully documented the failure of the flight crew to de-escalate the situation and the underlying racial bias that influenced the way she was treated. She was adamant that these issues be addressed comprehensively, not just in the context of individual incidents but as a company-wide issue. Her position on the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board ensured that her voice would continue to be a guiding force in the airline's transformation. As the months passed, Jasmine noticed a shift within Apex Wings. The company began holding mandatory diversity training for all employees, not just for flight attendants but for all staff, including executives. These training sessions were designed to help employees recognize their own biases and learn how to navigate difficult situations in ways that were more empathetic and inclusive. Jasmine was also involved in the creation of new guidelines for how the airline staff would engage with passengers. The goal was clear: no passenger, regardless of race, should ever feel unwelcome or suspicious because of their appearance or background. Externally, Apex Wings worked to regain customer trust. The airline launched a campaign highlighting its commitment to diversity, emphasizing the steps they were taking to improve. They also invited feedback from passengers, urging them to report any incidents of bias or mistreatment. The airline made it clear that they were serious about making changes, not just to appease the public but to genuinely improve the experience for everyone who flew with them. Jasmine's involvement in these efforts was crucial. She had become an unexpected leader in the movement for change, and her personal experience had inspired many others to speak up about their own struggles with bias in the airline industry. As her story continued to resonate, she was invited to speak at industry conferences, where she advocated for broader systemic changes within aviation. Her call for transparency, better conflict management, and comprehensive diversity training was gaining traction in the wider industry. Despite the progress, Jasmine knew that the work was far from done. The road to true change was long, and the impact of her experience would continue to reverberate for years to come. But as she looked at the steps Apex Wings was taking, she felt a sense of hope. The airline was no longer just reacting to a crisis, it was taking responsibility for its part in the problem and working to be part of the solution. Jasmine Miller's experience aboard Apex Wings Flight 347 had turned into something much larger than just a personal incident. What had begun as an individual confrontation between a black woman and a white passenger had quickly become a symbol of the broader issues of racial bias and systemic injustice that existed not just in the airline industry but in society as a whole. Jasmine's composed response to the accusation, and her subsequent advocacy for reform, had sparked a nationwide conversation about how people of color were treated in spaces traditionally dominated by white individuals. It wasn't just an issue of customer service. It was about recognizing the subtle but pervasive ways in which race influenced interactions and opportunities in every corner of society. As the viral video spread and the media continued to cover the aftermath, Jasmine became a public face for racial equity in the airline industry. She spoke at conferences, appeared on news outlets, and became an advocate for systemic change. Her experience had been painful, but it had also given her a platform to push for the changes she knew were necessary. A key part of Jasmine's message was the importance of transparency. She repeatedly called for airlines to not just engage in diversity training but to make those efforts visible. She pushed for clear accountability structures and for airlines to be transparent in their responses to incidents of racial bias. The importance of reporting, tracking, and addressing issues of discrimination was at the forefront of her advocacy. She wanted to see an industry where bias wasn't just addressed after an incident had occurred but prevented from happening in the first place. Her call for transparency extended to the broader corporate world as well. She encouraged companies to move beyond tokenism and focus on real, meaningful change. She wanted organizations to create environments where everyone felt not only included but valued, where people of color could thrive without fear of being judged or targeted based on their race. While some executives in the aviation industry were resistant to these calls, others began to listen. Slowly but surely, the conversation that Jasmine had sparked was gaining traction. Her influence was undeniable. But even as she continued her work to push for change within the airline industry, she knew that the fight was far from over. There would always be new barriers to break down, new conversations to have, and new challenges to face. But Jasmine was determined to keep fighting, for herself, for other passengers, and for the future of an industry that had the potential to lead by example. Her experience had shown her the power of standing up and speaking out, and she would continue to use her voice to push for the systemic changes that were so desperately needed. It wasn't just about changing one airline, it was about changing the entire industry, and beyond that, the way society addressed issues of race, bias, and equality. Jasmine's journey had only just begun, but she was already making history. As the dust began to settle following the intense media scrutiny, Jasmine Miller found herself at a crossroads. The viral video of her confrontation with Thomas White had sparked a much-needed conversation about racial prejudice in the airline industry, but the work was far from over. Jasmine knew that true, lasting change could only come from continued effort, not just from her but from the industry as a whole. Apex Wings, under the leadership of CEO Robert Jackson, was taking significant steps, but Jasmine was determined to ensure that those efforts didn't just become another corporate response to a public relations crisis. The airline's internal transformation, which had already begun with the overhaul of employee training, was now moving into its next phase. Jasmine was personally involved in the process, contributing her experiences and insights as a member of the new Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Her role wasn't just about pushing for policies that addressed racial bias, it was about creating a company culture where diversity wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated. Apex Wings had made it clear that they were committed to change, but Jasmine remained cautiously optimistic. She had seen companies promise reform in the past, only for it to fade away once the spotlight moved elsewhere. But this time felt different. With her input, the airline was integrating diversity training into its recruitment processes, ensuring that people from all backgrounds had access to opportunities within the company. The new conflict resolution guidelines also promised a more structured approach to handling sensitive issues, ensuring that incidents like hers wouldn't be ignored in the future. Still, Jasmine knew that her involvement couldn't be just about reforming one airline. The industry at large needed to be held accountable, and she continued to use her platform to advocate for systemic change. She was invited to speak at several major conferences, where she emphasized the importance of transparency, inclusivity, and the need for accountability within the corporate world. Jasmine called for a standard that would hold all airlines accountable for their treatment of passengers, particularly people of color, and urged other companies to follow Apex Wings' example. The national conversation that Jasmine had helped spark continued to gain momentum. Activists, industry leaders, and everyday passengers were all pushing for the same thing, a more inclusive, respectful environment in the skies. Jasmine's experience had become a touchstone for broader discussions about race and bias, and she was committed to ensuring that these conversations didn't stop just because the media coverage died down. As she looked toward the future, Jasmine knew there was still much work to be done. She wasn't naive enough to believe that change would happen overnight. But she was certain that she had started something important. She had turned her painful experience into a powerful movement for equity, and she was determined to continue pushing for change, both within Apex Wings and the broader industry. The journey wasn't easy, but Jasmine was resolute. She had found her voice, and now, she was using it to create a better, fairer world for everyone who would follow. In life, we often encounter moments that force us to confront uncomfortable truths, about ourselves, about society, and about the world around us. Jasmine Miller's experience on that flight from New York to Los Angeles was one such moment. What began as a seemingly minor misunderstanding quickly escalated into a dramatic confrontation that exposed deep-seated racial biases. This experience, though painful, became a catalyst for a larger conversation about race, privilege, and systemic inequality. It reminds us that biases, whether conscious or unconscious, are present in our everyday interactions, and they can manifest in the most unexpected ways. Jasmine's story is a powerful example of the importance of staying composed in the face of injustice. She could have reacted with anger, frustration, or resignation, but instead, she chose to remain calm, dignified, and firm in her belief that she had done nothing wrong. Her response in the face of public scrutiny was a testament to the strength that comes from standing firm in your own truth. It shows that even in the most challenging situations, we have the power to control how we react and to take the higher road. However, the lesson extends beyond personal conduct. Jasmine's ability to turn a personal injustice into a platform for change underscores the importance of using our experiences, even the painful ones, to spark broader transformation. When we face discrimination or bias, it's crucial to not only stand up for ourselves but to use our voices to advocate for systemic change. This is especially true for those in positions of influence, like Jasmine, who can help reshape cultures, systems, and industries. Her decision to share her story publicly and call for action was not just for her own benefit but for everyone who has ever felt marginalized or unfairly targeted. Jasmine's journey also highlights the significance of accountability. In her case, the airline, Apex Wings, initially failed to act, but once confronted with the public outcry and the powerful report Jasmine submitted, they had no choice but to address the issue. Real change, however, requires more than just a superficial response. It requires a commitment to long-term systemic reforms, things like better training, a deeper understanding of diversity, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about how biases shape our behavior and decisions. Jasmine's insistence on real, actionable change challenges us to demand more from the institutions we interact with daily. In a broader sense, her story encourages all of us to be better listeners, more conscious of our biases, and more proactive in fostering inclusive environments. We are all part of this societal fabric, and it is our collective responsibility to help weave a future where fairness, respect, and dignity are granted to everyone, regardless of their background. Jasmine's courage to speak up and push for lasting change serves as a reminder that we each have a role to play in shaping a better world for future generations. Thank you for watching this video. If you found value in this message, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for more thought-provoking content. Let's continue these conversations and work together for positive change.